There is a lot I could say about this painting in terms of the color choice, the contrast, and the general composition of the objects. In a later video, I'll probably explain the importance of having a composition which can be viewed from the multiple perspectives of the full and both halves. This is particularly important when designing any book or album cover. My main mindset heading into this painting was that I wanted to imagine someone who is just finishing their long journey. I wanted to convey someone who was excited to finally reach their destination, and I sort of used it as a metaphor describing us as graduating students. And as we take a closer look at this painting, there are a couple little tricks that I used in order to create this glowing effect that you can see along the grass and the leaves. As we zoom in onto this patch of grass and tree leaves, you'll notice that there's a wide variety of different colors all within these tiny little areas. And if you're a little more familiar with acrylic painting, then it would seem quite clear that many of these colors were placed directly on top of one another. We'll be taking a closer look at how layering paints can lead to very subtle effects and textures, some of which you may want to utilize in your future paintings. So let's say you open up any digital art program. If we take the basic drawing tool and set the color to brown, we can draw ourselves a little rectangle. Very nice. We can then switch to a lighter shade of brown and draw on top of that. What you'll notice is that when you start to draw on top of the brown section, the color of the line will appear no different to when you're drawing on top of the blank section over here. In general, we can say that the color of the line is not dependent on what kinds of colors lie below it. So what exactly makes acrylics so special then? Well, most types of acrylic paint that you'll buy from the store will have the property of not being able to fully hide the layer of color underneath them. Let's say I painted a dark stroke spanning the canvas and then painted this brown line perpendicular to it. You're going to see that at the point where the lines intersect, there are still remnants of the darker stroke hiding beneath the paint. So it's like we're forming a third color right where the two lines intersect. When it comes to applying layering when I work on a painting, usually I'll incorporate layering the most when it comes to texturing objects that have a lot of fine detail on them. A good example of this is when I try to paint the trunk of a tree. The first thing I'll do is apply a brown base color to the canvas, usually being a mixture between burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and titanium white. This gives myself a color that usually looks like this. Now on its own, there's nothing real special about how the color looks. In fact, it looks a lot more gray than it does brown. And this is due to the tree trunk that I'm referencing happening to look a lot more gray than it does brown. At the current moment, it is just a gray blob. But with layering, we can actually make this blob start to look a lot more realistic. Please note that not every tree trunk is going to look like this one. And depending on where your landscape painting is based off of, you're going to have to make some adjustments on how you end up painting the bark of that specific tree. I'd strongly recommend for you to try and go out and get as many photo and real life references as you can, because you probably wouldn't want to paint a tree trunk like this one when your forest setting contains mostly birch trees. Moving on to layer 2, I'll probably begin by painting the ridges and trenches of the bark. This time, I'll mix a darker shade of brown by mixing burnt umber and ultramarine blue. You could mix black paint with this, but just be very careful, since there's a good chance that if you add too much black paint, the mixture will become way too dark and the realistic effect will fade away. Side note, if you do not care about realism, then going extra dark might actually be a good thing. Perhaps you do want that extreme contrast in your painting. I don't know. Notice once again that there's nothing inherently complicated about what I'm doing right here. All I'm doing is I'm painting a lot of narrow lines with a few crossovers here and there. This next part is when things start to get a little more fun. Taking a closer look at this tree trunk once again, we can see that there's some orangish areas all across the bark. If we take an even closer look, we can also see the bright green little leaf thingies that are scattered all across. To create the look, I'm first going to mix this orangish color by mixing burnt sienna with a tiny bit of both bright yellow and bright red. Just a very tiny bit of bright yellow and bright red. And because this orangish look is going to be very subtle at the end, we're going to apply a very thin layer of orange paint. This can be done either through wet brushing, dry brushing, or just by layering the paint on thick. Because we're going to be layering more paints on top of the orange anyways, you can get away with most of these methods. The brown paint on top, after all, will make this orange layer a lot more hidden. I'll usually prefer to dry brush this orange paint onto some of the ridges. To do this, you're usually going to take some kind of fine brush, I prefer one with a flat top usually, and wet it with water. Then, you put the bristles onto some sponge towels nearby to remove most of that water afterwards. Once it's dry enough, dab the bristles to pick up a tiny bit of the orange paint, and then you brush off more of that paint somewhere on the side of your palette. What you do not want to do is lay a thick layer of paint by accident while dry brushing, and this is one of those areas of technique that you have to keep on practicing over and over again before you can actually have a proper feel for how it works. Finally, I'll begin laying down some brush strokes onto the ridges so that there's a smooth blend between the orange sections and the brown sections. It's a pretty subtle effect, I'll admit, but once we add the final layers to the bark, it'll help make the image feel a lot more natural and rich. As we start applying the third layer to this image, we should first understand that because the dark brown lines do stay opaque on top of the light brown paint, we do end up getting this very sharp effect that instills a lot of contrast within a very small area along the canvas. This in its own right can create some interesting effects to the viewer's eye, especially when you look at it from afar. An example of myself using this effect was a few months ago, back when I made this space telescope painting. As you can see on the outer ring of that space telescope, it looks like there's a bunch of lit up buildings on it. And that effect is super easy to do. All you really have to do is just take some white paint, draw some lines, some dots, kind of make it have like those different building shapes. And then you take some darker gray paint, go on top of that to give you some darker areas, get some of that variation in the lighting. And then it kind of creates a cool effect where it does look like a city, from afar at least. Moving back to our tree trunk here, it does make sense that at this point, we should try to reduce the sharp contrast between the ridges of the trees. So more often than not, the next layer is going to have a bright neutral color, softly fading into a darker neutral color. This is how we form the shadow on the right side of the bark. And what we're going to do is take two grayish brown colors, we'll mix one that's fairly bright and one that's a little darker, and I'll show you a chart showing like the approximate paint proportions to mix that. At this point, we'll repeat the same process of dry brushing the right side of the trunk until the shadow is dark enough. We can also use the dry brushing technique to make sure that the left edge is soft enough so that it easily transitions into the brighter shaded grade. Then we'll clean off the brush and do the same process on the left side onto the bark with the brighter shaded gray until we reach the point where there's a nice gradient between the light and dark areas of the trunk. One of the toughest things about learning to dry brush correctly is to make it look to have a smooth look. A lot of times when you're first starting out dry brushing, it generally is very rough and most people can kind of notice the little ridges, like the paint leftovers when you do it, especially on a rougher canvas. But that's besides the point. Anyways, as we can see here, the dark brown lines and the orange spots can still be seen from before. It is this property that makes painting with acrylics so special, as we can not only see these layers of paint showing from underneath, but we can also alter how much we see from those bottom layers by simply layering more paint on top. If I wanted those lines to barely show through the layer, then I would either dry brush or add a wash of that same paint again on top. An example of this effect can be seen in this other painting I made a year ago. If we look specifically at that tree over on the right side there, we'll notice that I had the same kind of process going on. There were clearly a lot of dark furrows painted on from the previous layers, but because of the dry brushing, those furrows look a lot more shallow, and the texture on the bark ends up being more subtle and pleasing to the viewer's eye. And finally, if you want to go full out with the detail, I do recommend first mixing up a very light shade of gray, and then using a fine brush tip to add the highlights of some of the ridges. Then, if you need any more small shadows behind the individual ridges, feel free to mix up some dark brown paint and very carefully repaint in the furrows again. And if you're going to do this, please try to keep the shadows very slight and subtle. Finally, if you want to add any tiny leaves and whatnot, take a bright mixture of yellow alongside a hint of green or blue paint. So why exactly is texturing in painting so useful then? Like, my methods of texturing objects in my paintings are just one of many different methods that other people use as well. And my general take on the importance of texturing and pure technique in general in the arts is that it helps aid our core ideas for any sort of art piece that we have in mind. If you have a dream, if you have an idea that you really want to convey in the form of an image, texturing is sort of like the way you execute it. In the same way, musicians will have all these cool little techniques that they add into their songs to create something that is inspiring to all of us. Visual artists often use these texturing techniques to deceive the eyes, but to deceive them in a way that it makes sense. What is just one simple texturing technique, you start to add them together, you find similarities between them. And it's through that process of like understanding what you're doing and bringing them together that you create something really special. When you start working with experimental effects, you start to understand the personal impact it has on yourself. You can then use that impact to sort of suit your main ideas in future painting projects. Texturing helps you reveal your own style, and is the way you communicate to other audience members that are viewing your pieces. In general, it's just one aspect of how you reflect who you are to others, and it also is another aspect in the decisions of what types of textures you use in how you execute your ideas and goals. And that is all for this video today. If you can't tell, I'm obviously experimenting right now with the way I'm doing audio, how I'm doing my voice recordings. I've been having a lot of trouble getting a good setup in my room here to be able to like effectively create videos that are of high quality. But I also, like I said again, I do enjoy all of this. It's a lot of fun getting to know what works and what doesn't work. And I hope in the future I'll be able to create videos that end up being a little bit better, you know? I hope to ultimately teach you guys the ins and outs of analyzing art and doing it. And with that all said, thanks for watching and have a good one.